Okay, so hello everyone. How are you doing? First of all, excuses for the picture. I'm the only speaker in the whole 3-day event, I think, who doesn't have a proper picture. This is mainly because I'm lazy as fuck. I promised to send them one, but I didn't really get around to because I have a master's degree in procrastination. But I think they got back to me by misspelling my last name a bit because the N is after the E, so we're even now. But let's get to the talk, right? I'm talking about building libraries with Vue CLI, and I will give you some tips about best practices and recommendations. So this is working, okay. Who am I? My name is Thorsten Lu. You may know me as Linusborg from the forums, from Twitter, from the issues, on GitHub. Not really on Stack Overflow because I hate that website. I'm a Vuejs core team member, the forum question answerer, and yeah, that's most basically all there is to know about me. And the thing that I want to talk about is basically this, right? So you have phase one, Vue curate your lib, then you end up with this boilerplate to create an application and not a library. So what are you going to do? There's a big question mark, but at the end you want to have profit, right? So this is what we're going to be talking about. There's a quick, simple part where we're just creating the project setup with the CLI. Then I will be talking about how to write a proper entry file, because the entry file to your library is basically the API of your library that you're exposing to the user. So this is a job you have to do well. And in the end, we're doing a little bit of Weight Watchers stuff, so our library size isn't getting out of control. So what is Vue CLI? Well, if you don't know, you skipped some talks today, so you're bad and you'll be lazy. So I won't be really talking about that. There were enough talks about it today already, I think. Instead, I will straight get to the project setup with the CLI. So the default setup is for apps, right? So you just can, after you have run Vue create, as I just showed, you can run yarn build, and you get this compiled application, right? But this is not what we want, right? We want to build a library that other people can consume in their applications. But Vue CLI can do this as well. We have a command for it that is a little bit more complex, but it's easy once you understand all the little parts. You are targeting a library. The library needs a name to be consumed in a browser when you include it with a script tag, and we also have to point to an entry file, which is, in my case, source index.js. And now what you're getting is a UMD bundle, minified and non-minified, and you get a common JS bundle as well. But there's more to do, right? Because we have to adjust a few files and folders because we still have this boilerplate that is meant for an application. Also, we have to adjust the build scripts that are already in our Package.json. And if we want to actually publish this library, which of course we want to do to get all the karma for it, we also have to add a few new fields to the Package.json to actually make it work. So step one, adjusting build scripts. My recommendation would be to not throw away the demo application that you received, that you have in your boilerplate. Just move it to a demo folder, because you will probably need a small application where you can hack with your component, where you can test it in a browser, at least if you're like me, because I can't do test-driven development. I always have to fiddle around in a browser, and then I write a test when I think it's working the way I want it to. So we just removed the whole source folder, right? So we at least need an entry file to write a component with. So we just create that file. And then in the main file of our new demo application, we just include the source folder, and then we can include the plugin to test it, right? So that's easy enough. The next question is, what's the perfect folder structure to where to put shit, right? And it's a never-ending story. And until this website appeared, React file structure search.sh, and it's a very simple website, so I will share it, and it basically looks like this. So I won't be getting into that at all, because it's a totally different thing if you're writing something like Vuetify versus you're writing a small library that is just a directive or a mixin or whatever. So I don't really see any sense in making recommendations about how to structure that stuff. This is totally up to you, and is totally dependent on what you want to build, right? Okay, customize your build scripts. So this is what comes out of the box if you tick all the boxes for unit tests, end-to-end tests, because of course we are writing tests, right? And this would still bundle an application, because Vue CLI service build would get you the first command line output that I showed. What we instead want is mostly this, right? We are having a serve command that is starting our development server with a demo app instead of the normal source folder stuff. We may also have a command to build the demo application. Maybe you want to put it alongside your documentation on Netlify or something, which would be easy enough. And we have the actual build command, which is meant to bundle and to build a library. And this is basically the command that I showed you before. So that's all there is to do here, right? Also simple enough. And the third step here is to add a few library-specific fields, because we have to tell, in order to be able to simply say import urlib from string urlib, Webpack has to know in which file to look, actually, which is the main file, right? So the main file here is the UMD file, because the UMD bundle works everywhere. It works in the browser, included with the script tag. It works in Webpack and Rollup, wherever. We also have a browser field, which basically is meant for bundlers like Webpack when they consume your library, and they basically tell the bundler, hey, don't use the main file, use this instead. So we can tell Webpack to not use the UMD bundle, because the overhead that is involved in this bundle, we don't really need it. We can just use the common.js bundle. There are also like these little neat fields for popular CDNs like JS Deliverer or Unpackage, where you can tell them where to find the minified version of your entry file. And of course, it's a good idea to expose your source folder, and of course your dist folder mostly, because maybe people want to use something from your source, or they want to build it from source. I will get to that later. That's the little asterisk on the end. And another little short note is to make Vue a pure dependency, because you should not be installing Vue as a dependency. That's the job of the consuming application. And yeah, but that's pretty much about it, right? So the next step is the entry file. So please come in, right? That's the entry to your library. And it's not really hard to write an entry file that works, but there's a few little bits and pieces that you have to watch out for to accommodate different use cases. So starting simple, a very simple entry point would be like this, right? You import your component, Vue loader is working with it, you're exporting as a default export, and that's all there is to it, right? You're finished, done, amazing. But there's more to take care of, right? Usually you have more than one component, or you want to allow your users to use it as a Vue plugin via Vue.use. You want to make this plugin customizable, so you have to find a way to provide options to the user to like say, hey, I want this variation of the plugin, or I want this variation. And also, it's common courtesy in the ecosystem to automatically install a plugin when you're included in a browser with a script tag. So it works pretty much like a jQuery plugin. You know the days you had jQuery on your page. After jQuery, you included your jQuery plugin, and it was just there. You didn't have to install it in any way. So dealing with multiple components is also easy enough, right? Instead of one component, we have two. Now we have two named exports, and if you want to still a default export, and it's easy enough to use, right? You could just import the components from your library, and you can register them globally, even though Eduardo just told us to not do that. Well, the reality is, I'm of the opinion, if you have like a really small library that you have to use globally, then it's totally fine. Also, there are things like global mix-ins that you sometimes have to use, and those really have to be done at the very beginning, because otherwise you would create components that don't even, component instances that don't even have this mix-in. So it's also fine to do, right? But you could also, of course, do this for local registration, right? So what's the good thing? The good thing is you only import what you need. You wouldn't even have to import both of these components. You could just import one, of course. You can name the components whatever you like. The bad thing is, well, it's tedious with a lot of components. You don't really have a default name, so everybody has to think of something. And if the same library is used in different places, you don't really see, I know that component, I know that library, right? So, and also there's no easy or standardized way to provide additional configuration. So that's where Vue plugins come in, right? So what is a Vue plugin? A Vue plugin is very simple. A Vue plugin is just a method, a function that receives the Vue constructor as its first argument, and optionally an object with like options as the second argument. It's more to read in the documentation about it. But it's very simple. It just looks like this, right? It's basically the same example as before, but now we have a function install, and we're doing the component registration in there for our users, and then we're just exporting this install function. So the consumer just includes this, imports this your library, calls vue.use once, and it just works out of the box. Nothing to do with registrations or whatever. Very simple, very convenient, right? So what's good about this? Easy installation with 2 lines of code. No matter how many components you're registering, you're doing all the work for your consumer, right? The bad thing is, of course, in the example that I showed you, component names are hard-coded. And this is something that I really see a lot. So you end up with risking naming conflicts, especially if you name these components something very generic. So this is the problem that I'm talking about, right? This is absolutely an anti-pattern. You should not do that, because you never can imagine like whether your consumers have some standardized way of naming their components in the whole application that you are breaking, or whether your name is so generic that some other library has chosen the same name and they're breaking and you can't use them together. So you're forcing the user to hack around this, which is of course not nice. So you have to make it customizable. There's a lot of ways to do this. One of the ways, or one of the easiest ways, was probably to do this. So we have instead of registering the hard-coded name directly, we first check if the user provided us with a custom name for the component that we're about to register, right? So how would that look if you used it? It will look like this, right? We are still calling vue.use, but then we're not just passing the library, we're also passing a name for the Hello World component, and we're naming it Better World. And now we can use the Better World element in all of our templates. So this is cool because it's an easy way for users to decide how to name the components. You could also do different things. You could imagine to pass options to skip a few components, or to optionally include something else that is not included in the default install, right? But what I want to say is, even better would be to combine both approaches. So you have an install function as your default export, and you have named exports for all of the components that you are providing. So you're giving the user the choice of either installing them as a plugin or importing them locally, registering them locally, and just don't have this global registration and not forcing them to use that. So I see many, many, many libraries that don't really do all of it. They do either, they do only do the global registration, but they don't really think about all the different use cases. So this is one thing that's really important to get right. Okay. So making it even more customizable. So this is a slide that I never actually finished. I just realized before I came up here, so there's a big red to do on the side where I wanted to write notes. But I think we can get through it, right? You can see that in the options for this install function, I'm receiving the router instance, I'm receiving the store instance from a Vuex store, and I'm receiving a mixin, which is a Boolean in this example. And it's just to give you an idea what you can do. You can, for example, add a global navigation guard to your router. You could register a module with the store that you are using, or you could like add a global mixin if the user wants you to, right? And still, we are exporting as named exports all of the different things that we included up here and that we install here to give the user the option to do all of this in the way that they want to, right? And maybe lazy load some of that stuff. So the last point is auto-install when your library is included directly in the browser with a script tag. So this is also not really hard. It's also just a few lines of code. It's basically looking like this. We're just checking if we have a Vue constructor on the window, global object, and we're also checking if the constructor on the window is the same as the one that we are importing here up here, right? Why do we do that? Well, you could be in an application where you yourself are writing an application, a bundler, but you're still in transitioning, so you still have a global Vue instance included in a script tag as well. that is managing some other part of the page, right? You're not really doing an SPA right now. And we're doing this check to ensure that we are not accidentally globally registering our plugin with the other constructor. Okay, so that's about it for this chapter, right? So what have we learned? We have learned that we should always export all components, and by components is a placeholder for directives, mixins, store modules, whatever your plugin is about to provide to the user, right? Always export all of these things individually as named exports to offer your user the best experience to customize what you're offering. But also offer them a way to install it as a plugin. Because, of course, we're developers, we're all lazy as fuck, right? So if it just does what you want it to out of the box, then it should be as easy as possible. And, of course, keep the plugin customizable so that you don't force the user to follow a specific pattern, a specific naming convention, whatever, and auto-install it for use in non-module environments. Great. So, third chapter, Weight Watchers. Because I guess we've all been there, right? You have triggered your build. You have just written a small, I'll get back. You have just written a small component or two. You're bundling it, and you're looking at the file size and thinking, whoa, this is huge. Where does all this weight come from? Well, one point to consider when working with the CLI is the default boilerplate is meant for bundling applications. And when bundling applications, this preset actually includes all the polyfills that your application needs. So if you bundle out of the box at the library, it will also include all of the polyfills, promises, generators for async, which are huge, which are probably like, if you're writing a small plugin, the polyfills are 10 times or 100 times as big as what you're actually writing yourself. So, of course, you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to include these. So it's pretty easy. You just adjust two options in the preset. You say you don't want to use the build-ins, and you don't want to use the default polyfills that the Vue CLI is including for you as well. And this means that you don't include any polyfills with your components, but it also means that you have to keep an eye on which polyfills you're using, because you have to document for your consumers, like this library requires a promise polyfill or something. And it also means, in practical terms, you shouldn't be using too fancy code in your library, because then you will lose track of what is required, or you're forcing your users to add another Babel transform for some fancy stage 1 stuff that will never make it into ECMAScript. So this is that, yeah. Another big point is externalized dependencies. So you should not bundle runtime dependencies. So, for example, if you're using Lodash in your library, you should not bundle it, because first, Lodash is huge, and even if you're tree shaking it or just using one of the Lodash this one function packages, some other library or even the consumer of the library could use the same thing in another place in their application, and you're essentially including it twice, which means extra weight. So the important thing is to tell Webpack via the externals option that it should not actually include these dependencies. It should just ask the consuming Webpack application, give me this dependency. I require this dependency to work. Vue CLI also already does this automatically for the Vue package, because we know that you probably will import Vue in some place in your plugin, and we just want to protect you in this way to not accidentally import it as well. But people who are not using Vue CLI 3 often miss that. So I have seen plugins that are like 2 kilobytes in size, but they end up being 30 kilobytes in size because they included Vue with it. And also they get problems because now their plugin is using a different version of Vue than the actual application, and they're wondering why some stuff is not available, and so that's creating a lot of problems. So how do we do that? It's actually not really complicated. Let's say we're importing Lodash in our index file for our component. In the Vue config.js file, we have the configure webpack option. Here we can set the externals option and say, hey, Lodash, we want to make Lodash an external dependency. And if you're consuming my library via common.js, so in a bundler, then just simply ask this other bundler for the Lodash library. And if you're including my UMD bundle directly in the browser with a script tag, then use this global variable to get it from the window object. In this case, it's the underscore, so it's looking a bit weird, but I think you know Lodash well enough, right? So the important point is to document this, right? Especially for users that are using your library in a browser, because we just externalized Lodash, so we have to actually include Lodash before we are including our lib, so it's available on the global window object before our library is actually parsed. Another point, handling CSS. There's two options, basically. This is the default setting that I just wrote down. You wouldn't even have to do this. So by default, CSS is extracted into one CSS file. This is not so great because for a library, it has to be manually imported alongside of the JavaScript import, like this. But the good thing is people can just ignore it if they choose to customize the CSS for this component themselves. So they don't have to import your CSS and override it. They can just ignore it. The alternative is to not extract. Well, that means that the CSS is bundled in your JS file and will be injected into the DOM at runtime. The bad thing about this is that you can't get rid of it, right? Because it's in your bundle, it will be included no matter what. You can't really remove it before you serve it to the browser. But the good thing about it is you don't need a CSS file. So I'm not going to tell you which is better because it always depends on what use case you have. Maybe you have a library that is very small and just have some required positioning CSS that you don't really want to override, then you can include it. Maybe you having a very opinionated design, fancy component, then you can use an external file because then you're offering the people the chance to simply ignore it and customize it for themselves. So there's a lot of possible alternatives. And now we get to tree shaking. And I had a lot of discussions with Sean in the speaker booth about this, and I actually had to change these slides a bit. But tree shaking, what is tree shaking? Who has heard of tree shaking? Who really understands it? You're seeing I'm not raising my hand, right? It's because it's complicated as fuck, but we tried to get through it. Tree shaking basically means the bundler knows which parts of the library you're actually using in your application and which you are not using. And then it's deleting the parts of the code that you are not using from your final bundle. This sounds nice in theory, and Webpack can do this for ES stuff that is important with ES 2015 modules. So if you're doing import this from that, Webpack can see that whether or not you are actually using this or not. But Webpack can't really tree shake from already bundled code. So to profit from tree shaking, your consumers must include raw source, which means they are not consuming the stuff that we just bundled with Webpack. They're consuming the source folder of your library. And there's a couple of catches to this. And just to stress, it doesn't work with bundled libraries. I fell into this trap as well. I thought I can use the side effects flag in Package.json, and then I would just magically tree shake my component, my common.js file. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work. So it only works if your consumer imports our source. Luckily, if your consumer is using a Vue CLI 3 project, they can just use this fancy option in the Vue config.js file, and they can say, hey, I have this lib that I want to compile from source, so please, Babel, don't ignore it. Instead, transpile this dependency for me. But the point is, it will be transpiled with the consumer's configuration, not with any configuration that we have in our Webpack for our library, because we didn't bundle it, right? So the point is, you shouldn't be using, so if you want to allow your users to actually consume your source folder, You shouldn't be using any unusual configuration or plugins for Webpack, because you would have to document all of this for your end users, and they have to adjust their Webpack configuration. If you must, of course, please document this. Otherwise, people will be very confused that it's not working for them. The best thing would probably be to, at least as a bottom line, only use stuff that comes out of the box with the configuration for a Vue CLI 3 project, because that's the bottom line configuration in the ecosystem that we want to establish. And one important point, and one of a sad point in a way, is you can't really use the de facto standard add paths, right? We have this nice shortcut in most CLI projects where you don't have to use relative paths, so you don't have to // to get to your component. You can just use the add as a placeholder for your source folder. But you can't really do that in your library's source code, because when the bundler is bundling your source in the consuming application, it would point to this application source folder and not to your bundle source, not to your library source folder. So you have to use relative paths, which some people would say is the only right thing to do. Sean over there, yeah. Yeah, so this slide is Sean Larkin approved as well. We basically all received a big Webpack workshop for free in the speaker booth because Sean couldn't stop talking. I have to explain this. No, Sean, you don't have to. I think I get it. No, get me a piece of paper. Get me a piece of paper. It was great. Anyway, to actually make this reliably work, you still have to put this flag into your package.json. The default would be to say, hey, Webpack, I don't have any side effects in my library, which means I'm not, when my library is loaded or when a file from my library is loaded, this file does not manipulate the global object in some way or do some other side effects except export something. But there are exceptions, and one exception would be the CSS that we're injecting when we're not extracting the CSS is a side effect, right? We are injecting CSS into the head of the document. That's a side effect besides the fact that we're exporting something from a library. And so, what do? Well, we can tell Webpack, hey, we have side effects, and it's every import that is ending with .css. So any import with a CSS file, also a virtual import from the script tag in a Vue file is a side effect. And so Webpack knows that it shouldn't ignore those because they are implicitly required. So how do you make sense of all of this? And how do you check yourself? Is there still something in my bundle that shouldn't be there if you're bundling? I just told you should not in some ways. Well, if you're bundling, we have the fancy UI thing that you just saw, but I have to rush through this. I only have 2 minutes left, shit. We have the report flag, which means you can run this with a report in the end, and then you get, when you build your components, you get a report HTML file, which basically looks like this. And this is the state that you would get if you have if you didn't fix your Babel configuration. You have core.js, which is this. Then we also have an external dependency, which is this right on the right-hand side here, and this is your actual library, right? So we would have to get rid of this, and so this would be the library. It has 92 kilobytes with all shit included. Now we fixed the Babel configuration. That shit is gone, so we are down to almost 20 kilobytes, but we still have this external dependency. Now we externalize the dependency, and now we're down to 14 kilobytes, which is much better, right? And so this is a neat little tool to just once in a while run and actually see what is all this stuff that is included here. Oh, I used the promise, right, so I included the promise polyfill by accident. So this is very useful. Okay. Further reading. I'm almost done. I think it will be very on time. So the funny thing is I have a team member in the core team called Kazupon. I hope I spelled it right. I was confused. He's from Japan, and 1 week before this talk, he came to me and said, he came to our Discord chat and said, hey, I made this plugin. It's called P11N. It stands for pluginization. It basically does all of the shit that I was just talking about automatically for you. So in case you didn't listen, we got you covered. Just install this, and you basically good to go, right? Well, not all of this, of course. He did some other things as well. It also installs VuePress and whatever, but yeah, check it out. Also, if you need some advanced patterns, if you're building like the next Vuetify, check out Chris Fritz's example repository here, which has like very advanced techniques about bundling individual components into their own NPM packages and shit like that. So that's also very interesting to like go to the next level, right? So that's all, folks. I hope you learned something. It was not one of those fancy talks. It was like down to the nitty-gritty details and all the wheels that you have to turn to like increase the quality and the bundle size of your library. I hope you can use it, and thank you.